there's a lot of predictions right now for how the Democratic Party is going to maybe do a little bit of a sweep.
What I've seen is a lot of what happens in Michigan is very representative of the broader nation. The irony of Donald Trump talking about election integrity just on its face, I think it's pretty comical.
The election that he lost was not in fact voter fraud, has still to this day said that it is.
But what is limerence? What does it look like? Peacocking that goes on social media where people are presenting a certain image that is
Wrong expectation on it. It's only designed to fail. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Washed Up. I'm Abby. This is Colin, and we comment on the weekly news so that you don't have to listen to the legacy media that your grandparents do. Today is August 9th, and we are continuing with our format of hard news and soft news. And this week, I'm going to be talking about the SAVE Act, how Donald Trump told Republicans to stay in Washington until they had passed his voting bill, the Save America Act, which is all about voter fraud and tying people registering to vote in federal elections have to provide more documentation and to prove that they're US citizens, and the Senate went home anyway. And I thought that this would be a fun topic to talk about because of all the primaries information or all the primaries that have been happening, as well as what's coming up with the midterm elections.
Yeah, so I haven't heard that we're talking about this topic yet. Abby is doing the hard news this week, so this is the first I'm hearing of this. But yeah, I'd definitely be interested to talk about with the midterms coming up. Everyone's talking about this, and as you said, the August recess for Congress just started, so they're basically going to be out of DC for the next couple of weeks, and that means that they're kind of closing in here on the deadline to possibly get something passed in advance of the midterms. But I haven't really looked closely at what is the substance of the SAVE Act. So if you want to maybe go through some of what it is would be instituting if it was passed, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I have a little bit of bullet points about what the SAVE Act is. So it stands for the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. And it would basically impose a lot of stricter federal photo ID requirements for voters. Some would have to provide, like, if you don't have an ID or a passport, like having to provide your birth certificate as well as social security card. And right now, different voter laws happen amongst states. So for these federal restrictions, it would be a much more stringent rule and allowing less people to be able to provide these things because they're not always readily accessible. Um it's a more, yeah, like I said, more stringent, and I think that it's a very interesting time, strategic time for Trump to be pushing for something like this when there's a lot of predictions right now for how the Democratic Party is going to maybe do a little bit of a sweep in some areas. So we've been seeing that a little more in the primaries as well.
Yeah, what you're saying tracks definitely with what I have heard, which is that Donald Trump is really big on this. He's been pushing it. He really wants the Republicans in the Senate to move on it. And that the Republicans in general are more in favor of stricter laws around, voting requirements, and the Democrats less so, if not being opposed to higher requirements. Although interestingly, I have seen public opinion polling from the US citizens who are generally in favor of more requirements in order to vote. I think people are really big on election integrity. It's kind of hard to make an argument against election integrity, but one that I have heard specifically against IDs, for instance, is, well, what if someone gets married and they change their name, or they're
Mhm.
just changing their name for other reasons? Is that going to make them ineligible to vote? And with especially the way they're trying to cram this legislation down and do so quickly, is
Like
that
right now in this time.
is that timeline really reasonable to expect that everyone's going to have their paperwork together? Particularly with, again, women who have just gotten married, changed their name. Women tend to vote more Democrat rather than men voting Democrat. It's just kind of the way the demographics shake out. So would that be giving the Republicans like a slight edge in certain cases?
Or people who have just moved to different areas. Like there have been more stringent laws about absentee ballots as well, which is also another hard thing to get by if you're like a college student, for example. Um, I think that there are a lot of arguments on maybe the more right side talking about how I would say on the extreme right side being like, well, like why would we allow like non-American citizens to vote? But like that's not the argument at all. Being a US citizen is already like obviously a legal requirement of having to vote, but it's more about like the way that citizens are proving that they live here over non-citizens being able to vote because that's not what the argument is at all. And I feel like we needed to clarify that there too.
I think also worth calling out, so in terms of people who might be changing their names or ha run into difficulties if you pass stricter ID requirements, I mean, also trans people would probably be less likely to vote just because probably they're changing their names at some point along the line. So is that going to interfere with like their official government name versus what names they use or go by? I think that could something to raise for sure. I would imagine most trans people probably would vote Democrat, although that's a generalization for sure. As I said, though, the public opinion poll seems really pro stricter requirements to vote. I know I've even seen they asked the American people about if we could pass an amendment requiring voter ID, would you be in favor? And I think it was a majority who said yes, regardless of their partisan affiliation. Have you seen any sort of analysis like that?
Yeah, I've been seeing some people taking the SAVE Act as more of like um a nonpartisan thing, which is interesting. I've been seeing a little bit of Democrats agreeing with it, but I've been seeing more of like independent people being okay with it. Like I think more people on the left are like, why is this happening right now? It just seems like the analysis on Donald Trump's motivations for like pushing it right now. And on August 8th, which was yesterday, feels like a million years ago, the Senate had worked nearly 20 hours. And Republicans ultimately failed to advance the voting legislation before leaving for recess. And there was an even that attempt to move forward with a narrow voter ID bill had also failed to advance. So that happened all yesterday, which is our like little quick update there.
They did confirm Todd Blanche as the Attorney General, though. They did that around 4:30 a.m. on Saturday morning. But I guess yeah,
This,
they
okay.
failed to get that through.
Yeah.
So wait, so what do you think Donald Trump's motivation primarily would be? Is it to again like disenfranchise people or make them less likely to vote?
Yeah, definitely. I think right now we're only a couple months away from the 2026 midterm elections, and Trump and his party have, I think, a longer history of things like redlining, gerrymandering, and this is just another attempt, especially with the timing right now, in order to, like you said, like disenfranchise some votes. I think the Democratic Party is starting to unify a little more, dare I say. Might be a little more on
Careful what you
the
wish for.
like on the more maybe socialist side right now. There's been a little bit more alignment,
A
such
lot of
as
buzz around the Democrat Socialists
yeah,
America platform and some of the candidates who advanced in the primaries, particularly in Michigan.
Michigan. Yeah. What were your thoughts on that? Did you have any?
Well, I mean, I was definitely following the races in Michigan with Rep. Haley Stevens. I think they were running for Gary Peters' Senate seat, which was
Hmm.
open. So in the primary, it was Haley Stevens versus El
Abdul
Sayed,
Majid. Yeah.
who won. El Sayed was, I think, a bit more of a like left-leaning DSA type, if I'm
Yeah.
not
And
mistaken.
he was endorsed by AOC as well.
Mhm. Versus Haley Stevens, who's a more like establishment Republican or Democrat rather, who's been a representative in Congress before.
Yeah, I think that particular election has been on the forefront of the mind for a lot of people in the Democratic Party. Honestly, people everywhere, I think, have been talking about it and the way that the Democratic Party is starting to lean, which is a lot lefter than I thought it would become. And maybe it's just the pendulum swinging back and forth. A lot of the times in political alignment, when something is so far right, we can say like MAGA, for example, the people want to overcorrect, and this is a little lefter than maybe some Democrats would think.
So correct me if I'm wrong. So in addition to maybe El Said being a bit more socialist than Stevens, Were they also in disagreement broadly about like Israel and Gaza and their
Yes.
support for Israel?
Yeah. I think that there was a lot of accusations about Israel controlling a lot of American government and politics, which I don't think is that far of an accusation in some ways. Like we can flash back to our times talking about
Iran war?
Netanyahu, but we have whole episodes about that, so go tune into those episodes. And I think that might have been the last little sprint that Al Said needed to win over anyone else. Yeah.
I was seeing a lot about like Stevens being endorsed or at least supported financially by AIPAC and how that was
Hmm.
kind of driving people toward El Said because he was really playing up the fact, I think it was around $30 million that was funneled through AIPAC to Stevens's campaign in an effort to essentially keep El Said off or not getting the nomination for the Democrats. But now that he has won it, he's going to be up against Mike Rogers in Michigan, and that race is going to tell you a lot about maybe where Michigan stands, but the rest of the country writ large, as Michigan is a swing state. And I think, honestly, what I've seen is a lot of what happens in Michigan is very representative of the broader nation.
Yeah, it's such an important state to look at when we're looking at larger politics. I totally agree with you in that sentiment. I do think that Al Seed has a really big chance of winning. Uh, I don't know. I don't know your thoughts on it, but
I think
I've been
so.
feeling like there's like a tide shift there.
Mike Rogers is very MAGA and endorsed by Donald Trump. So, in as much as Donald Trump's uh, is kind of going down in terms of his approval ratings and public support, I would imagine like him endorsing Rogers is not going to help all that much. Versus like again, El Sayed seems to have tapped into the frustration of not just Democrats vis-a-vis U.S. support for Israel, but also I think some moderates and Republicans who are seeing what's going on with Iran and Israel and our relationship with Israel as us being exploited. I could imagine them even backing El Sayed, although a lot of it's going to be contingent on how socialist is he willing to go. Is he going to be all the way socialist or more of like a like run-of-the-mill Democrat?
If he wants to play it right, I'd imagine like to get more votes, I'd imagine kind of playing the part of the run-of-the-mill Democrat. Like I do think that's the smartest thing to do to engage the most voters, especially independent voters who may not be as left or socialist as some people. But I mean, like we've seen like socialist Democrats win things such as Mamdani, obviously. So maybe that's just like where the tide is shifting as well in the Democratic Party.
Right. I mean, Mamdani was such a forerunner of where I think the Democrats are wanting to go. And, um, him and El Sayed both being Muslim, it is interesting because historically, I would think it would be unlikely that those candidates would be able to pick up enough majority support to even win the nomination. And so I think, Mamdani being mayor, El Sayed winning this primary is showing a definite shift in where people are. Um,
I like to see different forms of people or different people running simply because I think Colin and I have talked about like the typical like generational politician and the funneling of when you come from when you're basically bred to run for something. So in that way, I think it's really interesting to see different groups of people running and actually winning, which has seemed to change a lot over the past like couple years, like um in the grand scheme of things.
I definitely do agree with your earlier point, however, about if he wants to win, he needs to bring it back to the middle a little bit.
Hmm.
Like the Democrat Socialist platform, which they had like a spokesperson in the media who's getting hammered for saying that she supported abolishing the Senate and like wanted to have like basically open borders and like abolish all enforcement of immigration. And a lot of people are like, okay, we can agree with you in like certain ways. Like maybe ICE has been too heavy-handed under the Trump administration, but that doesn't mean that we want to just open up like all the floodgates of immigration. And let alone, she only wants, I think, an executive branch and not like again the Senate, which to me
That
the
almost seems so far. Like it's like a circle. Like when you're so
Yes.
far left, you become right.
Yes.
Like, why would we just want an executive? That seems like more of a monarchy,
Like
you know?
hello horseshoe theory of politics. Like yeah, that seems like pretty authoritarian to me, given that Congress is really supposed to be the people's house and the most representative of the people versus the executive who's like, yes, elected by the Electoral College and the people technically, but is less like beholden to the people than Congress, even the Senate.
Yeah, I think that that is a very interesting thing to say if you, especially as somebody who would be more, I guess, like on the far left side. Um, there is a lot of election strategy going around right now, and it is fun to analyze the different ways that people are going about things, especially what people are saying to the public. And I think as people in Gen Z, young people, and as like the way that so many people in government has lied this year, like blatantly, people are more on the lookout to see like what you actually want for what's to come. Like if you if you enter into this position, what are you promising us?
And there's so much happening around the midterms and in the pipeline for the next couple of months that honestly, like I've kind of avoided even bringing it up on Washed Up because it's such a Pandora's box, like talking about, you mentioned earlier gerrymandering. That's another huge debate that's been happening all across the country with certain states that are Democrat, like redrawing
Happening
their
here
maps.
too in Virginia, right?
In Maryland recently.
Maryland.
So I was just in Annapolis and they were having a
You have a vote there, no?
Yeah, I vote for Maryland
Okay.
and they were having a special session where they were trying to determine whether or not to try to pass an amendment this November that would allow them to redraw the congressional map in such a way that they would have all Democrat representation in US Congress as opposed to the one Republican who currently represents Maryland in Congress. And yeah, so that's going to be on the ballot for people from Maryland this November, but that's been happening in a lot of different states like California, drawing it to be more Democrat, Texas drawing it to be more Republican, Louisiana to be more Republican. And it's like they're all trying to carve up their state in different ways to get more representation. And that's raising real questions about like election integrity and whether or not the candidates who are running for office are even representative of the people who are voting for them. And I think, unfortunately, the more gerrymandered that we become, the less representative of the people that our Congress really is. And it's already so not representative of the people in the ways that the candidates who advance and get the most support and financial backing are oftentimes being supported by um, special interest groups.
Yeah, you have to think about these people who are running. They're just the face of so much that's going on behind the scenes. Like there's an immense amount of money, like like yeah, an insane amount of money that goes behind people who are running. Like if you think about like people who like friends with some people who work in campaigns and like what they talk about is actually insane when I'm like, oh my gosh. Um, it's a disgusting amount of money, honestly.
Is there anything else going on with, again, gerrymandering and the SAVE Act around election integrity that you think is something to watch or consider as we're approaching midterms?
I think all the main question is like how is each party using these things to benefit themselves? Um, Another interesting primary that I saw.
It's funny because we're watching, the news is on right next to us, and the headline on News Nation is Data Centers Backlash Shapes Midterms. And it's talking about really what you're talking about right now,
Yeah.
about how the parties are kind of,
They're
um,
using these things to shape themselves, like each
mhm.
party is. Most I would say mostly the Republican Party is looking at that right now, but I do think it's both really to see how they can benefit themselves in voters.
Right. I mean, they choose like these divisive issues and then they kind of take a stance on it in a way that rallies people around their cause in advance of the midterms, knowing that that's going to drive votes. So, for instance, everyone being pissed off about data center construction is just a really hot button topic right now. And so they are kind of stoking that fire in a way. Like, I think Democrats are more opposed to constructing data centers for various different reasons. The Republicans are more in favor because they think it's gonna fuel the economy with AI and whatnot, versus Democrats more concerned about the environmental costs and the eminent domain factor of all of it.
I think both can be concerned about privacy, though. That's like a common
Yes.
one between the two parties.
Yes. But right now they're kind of staking out their own claims to these various divisive issues in such a way that they know is going to drive votes for the midterms. And I would say don't fall for it because a lot of times the parties are not really that far apart on these issues. And once they're elected and once they're in Congress starting in January, they're probably going to come to some backroom agreements about most of these things.
Yeah, another election that I thought was interesting in terms of like the SAVE Act and the voting ID fight was how Republican John Husted won in Ohio, and he was one of the Republicans who was associated with the SAVE Act and implementing more stringent voting rules.
Are there any other races you're really watching in terms of primaries or now the actual midterm election itself, now that we know who the candidates are in some of these races, that you think are kind of going to be representative of the broader political debate happening?
Michigan for sure. I think Ohio is a pretty important state as well. Have you been seeing like other states you
I
think are
think
important?
Texas is one to watch. Their Senate race has been really interesting, where it's going to be Republican Ken Paxton, who was the Attorney General of Texas, and he's running against James Tallarico, who had to beat out Jasmine Crockett for that nomination for the Democrat. And so that's going to be an interesting one. Tallarico v. Paxton. Paxton has some interesting political ties and backstory that some people aren't too much a fan of. I think he had beat out John Cornyn for
Hmm.
that Republican nomination. And yeah, that could kind of tell you or indicate if Tallarico, who's a Democrat, actually won a Senate seat from Texas, that would represent a huge shift. Texas being so historically red and just almost well, kind of MAGA too,
Oh,
depending.
definitely. But yeah, I think that the more that these stories unfold and with elections coming up soon, it's definitely something that we and everyone here should keep track of.
So before we pivot to my sort of soft cultural news story of this week, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't point out the irony of Donald Trump talking about election integrity just on its face. I think it's pretty comical. I was just curious if you had any like last thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think that was a whole underlying theme of everything as well, right? Like he's like pushing all of this forward seemingly for election integrity, voter integrity, when it's actually just to benefit himself, when in fact he also, after time and time again, was proven that the election that he lost was not in fact voter fraud, has still to this day like said that it is, talking about all these like mail-in ballots and I think it is incredibly ironic and hilarious that he is choosing this idea when and that's another reason why I think people should dig a little deeper and look at these things and be like, why is he saying this? Oh, it's benefiting him and his party right now. And apparently voter fraud is only important when it is on his side.
Yeah, he's certainly willing to play partisan politics when it comes to the issue of election integrity, and that's why I don't take him seriously at all, that this is like a principled stand by the Republicans to like clean up the voter rolls or whatever. I think it is very politically motivated. They wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't advancing their own party interests. And as you said in the 2020 election, which he famously lost, he could not get over that. He still hasn't gotten over that in primetime addresses, he's brought it back up, saying that, oh, now we have all this evidence that there were widespread voter fraud in China and this and that. I don't even know.
Fox News literally admitted to lying about it too in their lawsuit, so they're literally known as an entertainment place now, and they're not allowed to be classified legally as like a news reliable source. So take that with what you will.
But he really latched onto the issue of mail-in ballots since that was so big during COVID. A lot of people were voting by mail instead of going in person. So he kind of took that to mean like, well, that's the avenue by which they're going to commit mass voter fraud. So he's been very against mail-in ballots and voting. But recently, the Supreme Court, I think just this past summer, decided that you can count ballots as long as they are you can count ballots that were mailed by election day. So even if it comes in after the fact, it's still countable. It still, is a legitimate vote as long as you can show that it was mailed on or by election day. And I think Amy Coney Barrett, our girl in the Supreme Court, was actually the swing vote on that, but that infuriated Trump, who has been on this rampage against mail-in ballots.
Hmm. But we'll have to see if this goes in his favor.
Okay, so I think we're ready for my
I'm so excited.
topic this week, which Abby's just hearing for the first time. For our arts and culture story, we're going to be talking about limerence.
Oh my gosh.
And the reason my excuse to bring that up now is that the Washington Post just wrote an article about this, and I was like, well, if they're talking about it, we should be talking about it. In fact, we've been talking about it pretty much all year. There was this really good book that came out. It's called, let me just triple check. It's called Smitten, Romantic Obsession, The Neuroscience of Limerence, and How to Make Love Last. It's by Tom Bellamy, who is a neuroscientist. And this book came out earlier this year, and it's just this kind of a summary of like what is limerence. It's essentially romantic obsession, but it takes on different forms and has sort of unique characteristics. What kind of differentiates it? There's certain like terminology around it as well. Like it's not just being obsessed with someone, it's like wanting it to have reciprocation. It's oftentimes fueled by
Hmm.
now that we live in the internet era where more information is available about everyday people who you encounter, it sort of opens up this panoply of access that wasn't previously available to people who were just like meeting organically, casually, and how that's kind of changed the entire dating scene in such a way that you can feel very personally attached to people who maybe you don't even have that close a relationship to in everyday life. And it just is like it's characterized by various different behaviors that are in essence being centered around trying to get reciprocation. There's obviously like the element of fantasizing around it too. But I just wanted to open it up to this broad discussion about limerence since the post is talking about it. I think we should too.
Yeah, I can't remember if we talked about limerence on the podcast?
No, I don't think so.
I guess in our private lives, we have been talking about it a lot. When you were just talking about what limerence is, I was thinking about like other pop culture things right now, and I do think that the rise of talking about limerence is especially happening this year. Have you heard about the movie Obsession that came out?
I did, but you have to remind me.
Yeah, it was a horror movie about how this guy really liked this girl. He ended up making this wish, saying that he wished that she loved him more than anyone else in the world, and it ended up just becoming this horror movie about how like she becomes obsessed with him, and then he like the whole underlying thing is that his obsession ruined both of their lives. And I think that this topic about people feeling attached to some people at the expense of themselves and even others has been on the rise this year. Like what to do when you have very strong emotions for somebody, like how you can get how you should treat yourself and how you should treat others. Because I think sometimes when you're so attached to somebody or the idea of somebody or become obsessed with somebody like in this way, sometimes people can convince themselves that they might be like entitled to have these emotions for people or emotions are okay. Have them like you back. And I think it's what you do with these emotions that set you apart from maybe a bad and good thing.
Right, totally. So like I think it's good to have this conversation about what is limerence, what does it look like? Is it something common and how is it being fueled by the current landscape and dating scene that we have now?
Hmm.
Because I think what I like about this book, which I read back in April, is that it really is trying to explain, you know, what does it look like? What are the features of it? So that if you're experiencing limerence, what can you do? And what I like is that he's a neuroscientist, so he's taking this approach of like limerence is essentially person addiction, where the person who is sort of the limerent object, the LO as the language it goes in this book, it's essentially someone who you're addicted to, and it's being fueled by this sort of like intermittent reinforcement pattern, which is another psychological concept of like kind of like hot and cold. Like sometimes the LO is like available to you and shows that reciprocation, and sometimes not. And someone can kind of get really caught up in and spin themselves up in trying to decode and like read the signs, and again, all of this being fueled by the way that the internet and social media works. When like in person, when that was the primary way that people were interacting, it was a lot more upfront. So like what people said was what they meant more so than I think there's a lot of like um, peacocking that goes on social media where people are presenting a certain image that is maybe not truly who they are authentically. And the more that you get to know them, I think idealism is also a part of limerence. So it's like putting someone up on a pedestal, thinking that they're the greatest, and overlooking all of the pitfalls of who that person actually is. And spending more time in person is really important for like taking people off of a pedestal
Hmm.
because you can see who they really are up close and personal and how they interact with others in their environment. And it's not just like seeing someone's post on social media and kind of filling in the gaps with your own imagination of who that person might be, which I think can get really, really toxic in the same way of like that movie that you're describing,
Yeah.
where the idealism of it just like really can become like all consuming. And before you know, it's like someone is rearranging their entire life around a person who they're essentially addicted to on like a neurochemical level.
Yeah, and I think that's really why it's so important to identify it, like if you've experienced it or have or maybe are experiencing it, to identify it to not make any bad personal decisions for yourself in the long run because human emotions and liking somebody and feel having such strong feelings for somebody is so natural, but it's like what you decide to do with it that sets you apart from maybe a good and a bad person. I don't want to make it so like black and white, but I think like Obsession was a movie that like talked all about that. I'm sure that it talks about it in this book. I mean I haven't read it yet, but I think I've done like a a good amount of research on limerence. I first discovered the term back in 2024. A mutual friend of ours like had told me about it and I was like, "Oh, like let me look into this." And it happens a lot to, I want to say, people who are malleable in their younger years too, because at that point you haven't experienced a lot. And it's easy to tie your identity to someone when you haven't fully established your own. And it's even easier to maybe put a lot of your issues into this and become like, I guess, like quote, obsessed with a person, even if you don't really know everything that's going on in their lives or in their minds. Like placing this person on a pedestal allows you to also push ideas onto them and push these things onto them that might not even be necessarily true. It might just be made up in your mind.
Yeah, and there's oh my God, there's so much there. But first of all, I think it's funny we've each independent had people independently recommend that each of us look into limerence, and the more that I
What
do,
does
I'm
that
like,
mean?
the more that I do, I'm like, what does that say? But wow, there's so much there. What I like about this book is it gives like sort of stages of limerence, and it talks about how the first stage is sort of the glimmer is what it's called, where it's like a person draws your attention, or like sort of uniquely represent something to you, and it feels like the projection is just so immediately strong. And then there's sort of this like euphoric phase that's very much characterized by like this hope and optimism about, well, like this glimmer that I have around this person, the way that they draw my attention, it must mean something. And we can't sort of separate like maybe we're making it mean something, which can I think sometimes be the case. And I think part of moving back, taking a step back when you experience like that initial glimmer or even the kind of fantasy phase, the euphoria phase of the hope and the imagining and all of this, you have to, I think, look at the qualities about the person who gives you that glimmer. What do you actually admire about them? And then how can you start to embody that yourself? I think that's the best way to maybe get around limerence, or like the author of the book recommends basically like a full withdrawal of like you need to wean yourself off of this person who you're experiencing this addiction to as if it's a drug. I think there's something to be said for that. But I also think like if you really want to create a sense of resolution around it, maybe the relationship to that person isn't going to mean what you hoped that it meant, but you can really start to again like analyze, not not the analyzing of like trying to decode everything and like their every action and hope and reciprocation that you're desiring, but trying to analyze again, what do you admire about them? How can you start to embody that for yourself so that you're not going to be reliant on this person who you're in essence projecting onto, and that's fueling that addictive cycle.
Interesting. What I'm hearing from you is that people with limerence can often find these people who they have limerence for, um, and be attracted to the qualities maybe that they don't have, and maybe that's why they're so addicted to them. Like, so it would be a really maybe a good thing to do some deep inner work and look at people and be like, oh, I like this person because of A, B, and C quality. How do I include that in my life without feeling like I need to obsess over this person, or without feeling like the only way to get it is through being with this person?
Right. I mean, I think a lot of times attraction in and of itself is kind of rooted in this like wanting to bring something closer to you.
Hmm.
And I think sometimes it can be fueled by a lack. If you feel like you don't have something, then you want to bring it close to you to kind of like fill in a gap or something that you're missing. But I think that that is sort of the toxic negative side of attraction. I think attraction is very fleeting, but actual genuine love and connection is built on a much more solid foundation of mutual respect and values, shared goals. And again, like there has to be that reciprocation has to be from the beginning. It can't it can't be sort of spurred on by again what you're projecting onto someone. It actually has to be the basis upon which everything else is built up. And to me, like my operating definition of love is to take someone else's best interest as a part of your own best interest. And so that requires you to actually understand them to such an extent that you could actually represent what their best interest is, so as
Hmm.
to proactively, like again, meet that person's needs or expectations, or to show up for them in such a way that is again beneficial to them. And what limerence does is it kind of denies the opportunity for genuine connection because it's putting someone into a box before the relationship is even started, and it's saying
Hmm.
like, I have this ideal image of who you are and you must be only that thing or else I won't accept or I won't be able to handle the emotional reaction to being in a relationship with you. And I think, yeah, that's just basically like a non-starter for a long-term, healthy relationship.
Relationships in general too often are, when you enter a relationship with somebody, they often hold up a mirror to yourself as well, of the good and the bad things that maybe you didn't discover about yourself through the way that you are with these people. Because when you're with somebody in a romantic way, it's such a vulnerable thing. So to be going into a relationship already with a preconceived idea of who this person is, to the extent and thinking to yourself, this is going to solve so many of my issues. This is going to bring me everything that I've been looking for in life, and I'm going to be so happy. That's already putting such a strong expectation on it, to the point that it's only designed to fail.
Exactly. And that's what is so problematic about limerence is again, you're setting yourself up for that failure and that disappointment. And it could all be easily avoided with perhaps some, again, like deep soul searching about what is this, why am I actually drawn in this way to this person? Some soul searching and some direct, overt communication, I think go a long way to kind of curbing limerence. But part of why it's such a negative reinforcing cycle of addiction is that it's sort of like something that people oftentimes feel shameful about, where they're like, well, there's such a disproportionate pull that I have toward this person. I must like hide that because that's going to be embarrassing to me or cause me that great disappointment. And this is something we've talked about on Washed Up before about how I think Gen Z a lot of times is so afraid of experiencing that disappointment in a relationship that they'll do anything and everything to avoid it, including some very like drastic and self-destructive things. But really, if you just took it on the chin, the possibility that you could be disappointed, but you went for it anyway, and you kind of get the feedback of it, then you can learn something and move on and grow and not get caught in these cycles of um, hope and disappointment and devastation and like
Hmm.
all of the stuff that happens when people I think hold very tightly to their romantic ideal.
Definitely. Definitely. I'm glad you brought this one up, especially because it's been something that we've talked about as like on a friendship level outside of the podcast. So it's kind of fun to talk about it on the podcast.
Yeah, totally. And like I think this is something that people will continue to explore. Like I think in the same way that other pop psychology terms have really caught on in the culture, like nowadays everyone knows about narcissism and things like that, which are rooted in genuine psychology and research and science, but have taken on sort of a new meaning as it achieves sort of mainstream cultural where people, use those terms and have a shared understanding of what it means. I think limerence is one of those things that will also have a real foothold in the culture to the point where people are going to be using that term quite often to explain their different experiences. And I think it'll be a good, useful tool for kind of picking apart the nuances of, well, why is this different than just your run-of-the-mill romantic obsession? How is it unique to maybe the digital world that we live in now? And again, knowing all of that, what can you do to separate yourself from or not feed into those destructive patterns?
Yes, I really like that. Anything else you want to add in terms of limerence? Like,
Oh my God. Yes,
this could
but
literally be its own episode. We probably had hours of conversations about this.
I
I
mean,
mean,
there's so much I want to talk about, like attachment style also, and how, your attachment style can make you more vulnerable to limerence, where if you are an anxious attached person, then you're more prone to that like fixation and
mhm.
obsession and
I just listened to a
shame.
podcast this morning when I woke up, actually about anxious attachment style.
And like I love that Gen Z knows about these things and considers them and is not just sort of acting on impulse or whim when it comes to relationships, because I think we do value that self-awareness in relationship. But it can become also a lot once you become aware of these things. It's hard to put the genie back in the bottle in some ways. And I think I had known about limerence for quite a while, just being interested in psychology as I am, but I've avoided really diving deep into what does it look like, how does it present, is it maybe applicable to me in some instances? Because I think I have been afraid of once I know what it is, what does that mean for how I need to conduct myself moving forward? But I totally recommend reading that book because it'll give you some insights on that.
Yeah, we'll link it in the bio below. Yeah.
And also, last thing about that book, what I really like about it too is it's not only coming at it from like a neuroscience perspective of like what is the chemical reactions that are caused by attraction and reciprocation and connection, but it also dives into sort of like a Jungian frame, which is my favorite kind of psychology, and it is drawing upon some of the same stuff that Carl Jung was really interested in dissecting when it comes to dynamics of projection and how people relate to one another. Sometimes your relationships are being driven by like your complexes and again like the things that you hold in your mind that you're putting onto others rather than an actual relationship to that person as an individual. And I think what Jung would say about limerence is that it's essentially like a projection of the entire self onto the other, which again is an overwhelming experience for the other, but then it also denies you the opportunity of fully embodying self, which is what I think the goal of a individuated, healthy person should be.
Hmm. I think Gen Z, I could totally see this term becoming more popular too, and could see like future generations using it as a staple for maybe what not to do in a relationship.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, we could go on forever, but I think we're gonna have to cut it off there.
Okay. Washed
Washed
up
up
out.
out.